It was her first night, and what the millionaire whispered changed everything. She closed her eyes without knowing that moment would reveal the true meaning of being loved. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss the ending of this unforgettable night. Laurel's heart was beating so hard, it seemed to echo in every corner of the luxurious apartment in Greenwich Village, the most exclusive neighborhood in New York City. The soft city lights filtered through the large windows, drawing dancing shadows on the polished marble floor. At 21, she had never been in a place like this, where every object, from the paintings by renowned artists to the Italian designer sofas, seemed to whisper stories of privilege and power. Her hands trembled as Elliot held her face with a gentleness that completely disarmed her. His woody cologne mingled with the scent of jasmine drifting in from the external garden, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Some people enter your life like a gentle breeze, and others like a hurricane that transforms everything, thought Laurel, losing herself in those amber eyes that watched her with disconcerting intensity. From the moment I saw you drawing at that small exhibition in Salem, I knew you were different, he murmured, with that deep voice that seemed to caress her from within. There's something in your gaze that reminds me of who I was before I became this. Laurel didn't respond. She couldn't find words that could make it past the knot in her throat. Instead of speaking, she allowed her fingers to trace Elliot's perfectly shaved jawline, marveling at the contrast between her hands, rough from years of working with pencils and charcoal, and his smooth skin. What she didn't know, as she surrendered to that moment that seemed suspended in time, was that this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would transform her completely. That true love had a much higher price than she could ever have imagined, and that to find herself she would first have to get lost in a labyrinth of contradictions between two seemingly irreconcilable worlds. The city slept beneath a blanket of diffuse stars, dimmed by light pollution, while in that 20th floor apartment, two souls began to intertwine, ignoring that sometimes bridges between different worlds are built with silent sacrifices and uncomfortable truths. The dawn light filtered through the linen curtains when Laurel opened her eyes. For a moment, disorientation took hold of her. The immaculate white walls, so different from the weathered plaster walls of her room in Woodstock, seemed to observe her with a certain aseptic coldness. She sat up slowly, feeling the softness of the Egyptian cotton sheets against her skin. Elliot was no longer beside her. In his place, a note written in impeccable handwriting, "Morning meeting. See you tonight, E." As the coffee imported from the Pacific Northwest dripped slowly into the Italian coffee maker, an apparatus that had taken her 3 days to learn how to use, Laurel approached the window. New York City stretched out beneath her feet like a living, pulsating organism, so different from Woodstock, her hometown in Vermont, where colonial houses clustered along narrow stone streets and the church steeple marked the unhurried rhythm of life. "Do you like the view?" Teresa's voice, the housekeeper, startled her. "It's impressive," Laurel replied, uncomfortable in the presence of this woman who seemed to constantly evaluate her with a critical eye. "Mr. Elliot has left instructions. The stylist will come at 11 for wardrobe fittings, and at 1 o'clock you have an appointment at Le Petit Salon for a complete makeover." Laurel nodded, feeling a pang of uneasiness. 3 months ago, when Elliot had discovered her at that small exhibition in Salem, where her drawings hung timidly among other amateur works, she would never have imagined this scenario. He had stopped in front of her illustrations of the Vermont countryside, observing them with an intensity that had made her blush. "You draw with nostalgia," he had told her, without introducing himself, "as if you're trying to capture something that's already slipping away from you." That was the beginning. Daily calls, increasingly frequent meetings, until a month later he had proposed that she move to New York. "To explore your talent," he had argued. Her family, especially her father, a traditional man who distrusted any Manhattan big shot, had initially opposed. But Elliot had won them over by financing the complete renovation of the family home and installing a spacious workshop for her mother to continue with her New England quilting. The stylist turned out to be a Manhattan woman with exquisite manners and definitive opinions, who looked her up and down with a professionally neutral expression before declaring, "We have a lot of work ahead of us." During the following hours, Laurel was transformed like a blank canvas. Her hair, previously long and natural, was cut into an elegant bob with highlights that brightened her face. Her nails, always short so she could draw without hindrance, were sculpted into perfect ovals with nude polish. The wardrobe presented to her seemed straight out of a magazine. Silk dresses that slid over her skin like water, impeccably cut suits, shoes by designers she had never heard of. "Tonight there's an important dinner with Japanese investors," Teresa informed her when she returned to the apartment, unrecognizable even to herself. "The gentleman expects you to be ready by 8. That night, in the exclusive restaurant Per Se, surrounded by executives who talked about millions as if discussing the weather, Laurel experienced the first crack in what until then had seemed like a fairy tale. During the conversation, one of the partners asked her about her academic background. "I studied fine arts at Bennington College," she replied with a smile, then added honestly, "although I had to work at my uncle's store to pay for materials. In my town it's not easy." The uncomfortable silence that followed was almost tangible. Glances shifted to plates while Elliot, imperceptibly tensing his jaw, redirected the conversation toward new projects in Brooklyn. In the Mercedes returning to the apartment, he didn't raise his voice, it was worse. "There is certain information that is better kept private, Laurel," he said with a controlled, cold voice. "You need to learn to navigate this world. Not everything should be shared." It was at that moment, while watching the city lights slide across the tinted car window, that Laurel felt for the first time the bitter taste of shame and understood that perhaps the bridge between their two worlds was more fragile than she had imagined. "I can't believe you live here," exclaimed Wren, spinning around in the middle of the apartment foyer, her cheap heels clicking against the Italian marble. "It's like a palace," Laurel smiled, genuinely happy to see her best friend since childhood. They had gone 6 months without seeing each other, the same time she had been immersed in this new world where each day she learned the unwritten rules of a social class that had never been her own. "Come, I'll show you the rest," she said, taking her by the arm. Wren, with her strong Vermont accent and expressive gestures, seemed like a tropical bird amidst the minimalist elegance of the apartment. She wore a floral blouse she had bought at the Woodstock Farmers Market and tight jeans that evidenced her taste for accessible fashion. Her laugh, loud and carefree, resonated in the high ceilings, contrasting with the usual silence of those rooms. "And you say your boyfriend paid for all this?" she asked, examining a vase that probably cost more than all the furniture in her house. "Elliot is generous," replied Laurel, suddenly uncomfortable. "How lucky you are, girl." Wren let herself fall onto the designer sofa. "Everyone in town talks about you, you know. The girl who conquered a millionaire with her drawings." Something twisted in Laurel's stomach. Is that how they saw her now? As an opportunist who had used her talent to escape the simple life of Woodstock? "It's not quite like that, Wren. He saw something in my work." The sound of the door interrupted the conversation. Elliot entered, impeccable in his tailored suit, an imposing figure who seemed to occupy the entire space with his mere presence. His eyes settled first on Laurel, then on Wren, and finally on the latter's shoes, which had left subtle marks on the silk rug. "So you must be the childhood friend," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Laurel has told me a lot about you." Dinner proceeded with barely disguised tension. Elliot was politely distant, responding with monosyllables to Wren's enthusiastic questions about his business. When she mentioned, between laughs, anecdotes of the adolescence she had shared with Laurel, including that time they had snuck into a club in Burlington using fake IDs, his face imperceptibly hardened. After Wren's departure, as Laurel collected the plates, Elliot poured himself a whiskey and contemplated the New York lights through the window. "She seems charming," he commented, with a tone that suggested exactly the opposite, though perhaps too effusive for my taste. "She's my best friend since I can remember," Laurel replied, feeling a pang of loyalty. "Of course." He took a sip of his drink. "I was just thinking that perhaps it would be better if you met your old friends in more neutral places. A coffee downtown, perhaps." The words fell like stones in Laurel's stomach. The implication was clear. Wren, with her cheap clothes and her provincial accent, didn't fit in the elegant apartment that Laurel now called home. "Are you ashamed of my friends?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Not at all," he responded, approaching to caress her cheek. "I just want to protect you. This world can be cruel to those who don't know its codes. I don't want you to be judged by association." That night, as she lay awake beside the sleeping Elliot, Laurel felt something break inside her. The painful perception of being slowly separated from her roots, of becoming a polished but unrecognizable version of herself. The reflection that the mirror returned to her each morning was increasingly alien. The perfectly styled hair, the impeccable nails, the designer clothes. Where had the girl gone who drew with charcoal until her hands and face were stained? The one who sat in the Vermont fields for hours, trying to capture the light between centuries-old maple trees. In the dimness of the bedroom, a question began to take shape. What was the true price of the borrowed wings with which she now flew? "Have you seen this?" Elliot slid the tablet across the breakfast table. On the screen shone an article from the New York Times titled, "The New Patrons Businessmen Who Drive Emerging Art." Laurel took the device and read quickly. The article mentioned Elliot as one of the main investors in new artistic talents, specifically highlighting his support for a young Vermont artist whose work reflects the tension between rural and urban America. "They're talking about me," she murmured, surprised. "Of course they're talking about you." He smiled, serving himself more coffee. "I've arranged an interview for next week. The journalist wants to know about your creative process." Laurel felt a chill of unease. "But I haven't been creating anything new. Between the etiquette classes, the social events, and the shopping, I've barely had time to draw." Something changed in Elliot's expression. A fleeting shadow crossed his eyes before he recovered his usual composure. "That can be fixed," he said lightly. "I'll cancel your commitments this week. I want you to prepare some new pieces for the interview." That afternoon, for the first time in months, Laurel found herself alone in front of a blank canvas. The penthouse had been transformed into an art studio with the best tools money could buy: sable brushes, French oils, Belgian linen canvases. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Her hands felt strange, as if they had forgotten how to hold a brush after so much time holding champagne flutes and silver cutlery. For hours, she limited herself to staring at the canvas, paralyzed by a suffocating sensation of imposture. When the brush finally touched the surface, what emerged were not the idealized images of the Vermont countryside she used to draw. Instead, violent strokes gave shape to a female figure caught between two worlds, one foot on the red earth of the country, the other on the grey asphalt of the city, the body tensed like a bridge about to break. The sound of the door startled her. Elliot entered the studio, his gaze immediately drawn to the canvas. "It's intense," he commented, studying the painting with an indecipherable expression. "Not exactly what I expected." "And what did you expect?" asked Laurel, a new tension in her voice. "Something more accessible. Critics and collectors look for works that complement their spaces, that convey a certain serenity." "I can't create on commission, Elliot. Art doesn't work that way." He approached, placing his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that might seem affectionate, but that Laurel felt as a weight. "Of course, darling. I'm just thinking about your future. I want your talent to be recognized as it deserves." That night, during a dinner with an important gallery owner from the Upper East Side, Laurel observed how Elliot spoke about her artistic vision, as if he knew it better than she did herself. The gallery owner, a man of studied gestures and designer glasses, nodded while Elliot described Laurel's work in terms she barely recognized. "Her work explores the duality between tradition and modernity from a nostalgic but not sentimental perspective," he explained, while Laurel felt herself sinking into her chair. "There's a reminiscence of Edward Hopper in her vision of rural America." Back at the apartment, the silence between them weighed like lead. It was Laurel who finally broke it. "I don't recognize my work in anything you said tonight." Elliot sighed, loosening his tie with a tired gesture. "I'm just trying to position you appropriately in the market. Art is also a business, Laurel. I thought you understood that. I understand that you want to help me, but I feel like you're recreating me. As if the real Laurel, the one from Woodstock, the one who drew with hands dirty from charcoal, was a draft that needs to be corrected." He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and bewilderment, as if he didn't understand the source of her discomfort. "I'm offering you opportunities that many artists would dream of having. Contacts, exposure, recognition. I know, and I thank you, but—" Laurel searched for the right words. "Sometimes I feel like I'm building invisible walls around myself, walls that separate me from who I really am." Elliot was silent for a moment, his face partially hidden in the dimness of the apartment. Perhaps it's necessary to leave certain things behind in order to grow, he finally said. You can't cling to the past and expect to move forward at the same time. That night, as she contemplated the bedroom ceiling, Laurel remembered her grandmother's words. Roots aren't chains that tie you down, but anchors that keep you steady when strong winds blow. And she wondered if by cutting her roots she was gaining freedom or simply becoming more vulnerable to life's storms. The light in New Orleans was different. More golden, denser, as if the sun, before touching the centuries-old buildings, first passed through a filter of honey. Laurel noticed it immediately upon leaving the hotel where they were staying for Elliot's business trip. It's incredible, she murmured, as they walked through the narrow streets of the French Quarter, where the colorful facades almost touched above their heads. Elliot smiled, pleased with her reaction. During the past months, he had been so busy molding her to fit into his world that he had forgotten the simple pleasure of seeing genuine joy on her face. New Orleans is special, he conceded, observing how she stopped before each detail, the ornate wrought-iron balconies, the bursts of bougainvillea, the musicians playing on street corners. But wait until you see the French market. I think you'll love it. He wasn't wrong. As soon as they entered the market, Laurel seemed transformed. The place vibrated with colors and sounds, vendors announcing their products in a melodious southern drawl, the aroma of Creole spices mixed with the citrusy scent of freshly cut fruit, children running between stalls while musicians played for a few dollars. To Elliot's surprise, Laurel didn't limit herself to observing with the educated distance she had adopted in recent months. She immersed herself in the market, conversing naturally with vendors about pralines and local crafts, laughing at local stories, frantically taking out her sketchbook to draw scenes that captured the bustling essence of the place. Seeing her like this, with cheeks flushed from excitement and eyes bright, was like rediscovering the woman who had captivated him at that small exhibition in Salem, the authentic and vibrant young woman who had been gradually fading beneath layers of imposed refinement. "It's been so long since I've seen you draw like this," he commented, watching her quickly sketch the profile of an elderly woman selling aromatic herbs. "It's been so long since I felt like doing it," she replied without taking her eyes off the paper. It was then, under the relentless New Orleans sun, that Elliot had an uncomfortable revelation. He had been trying to mold her into something she wasn't, and, in the process, was extinguishing exactly what had attracted him in the first place, her authenticity. That night they dined at a small restaurant away from the tourist circuits. The place, recommended by one of the market vendors, had no Michelin stars or white-gloved waiters, but the food was extraordinary in its simplicity. Gumbo, jambalaya, étouffée. Laurel ate with an enthusiasm that contrasted with the restraint she had shown in the elegant New York restaurants, where each bite seemed calculated to maintain appearances. "This reminds me of my mother's cooking," she said, dipping a piece of bread into the seasoned broth. Simple but honest. Elliot observed her, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and fascination. When had he started seeing Laurel's roots as something to correct rather than as an essential part of her identity? "I've been thinking," he began with unusual hesitation in his voice. "Perhaps we should visit your family soon. It's been a while since you've been to Vermont." The surprise on Laurel's face was evident. "Are you serious?" "There's always some important event that prevents me from going." "I'm completely serious. We could spend a weekend there. I'd like to see the places you draw with such nostalgia." Something broke in Laurel's expression, a vulnerability she hadn't shown in a long time. "Why this sudden change?" Elliot contemplated his wineglass, searching for words for an honest answer. "Because today, seeing you at the market, I realized it's been months since I've seen you smile like that. And that scares me." It was a small but significant admission, a crack in the perfect facade they had both been maintaining. In the silence that followed, something changed between them, as if a door that had remained closed slightly opened, letting in a thread of light. Back at the hotel, walking under the stars along the Mississippi River, their hands found each other in a way that hadn't happened in months. Not as an automatic gesture or a public demonstration, but as a genuine connection between two people trying to find each other again. "You know what's strangest?" murmured Laurel, contemplating the reflection of the moon on the water. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize the person looking back. As if I were seeing a stranger who has usurped my body." Elliot squeezed her hand, feeling a lump in his throat. Because he, better than anyone, knew that sensation. He had experienced it for decades, each time he abandoned a bit more of himself to meet the expectations of a world that valued appearances over authenticity. And it was then that he understood that they were both trapped in the same cage, though in different ways. She trying to adapt to a world that was foreign to her. He a prisoner for so long that he had forgotten what freedom was like. The trip to Vermont materialized 2 weeks later. As Elliot's Audi advanced on increasingly narrow roads, moving away from the main highways, the landscape gradually transformed. Modern buildings and suburban developments gave way to open fields where centuries-old maple trees stood solitary against the horizon, like elderly sentinels of a slower time. "It's different than I imagined," commented Elliot, observing the Vermont countryside that extended on both sides of the road. "What did you expect?" asked Laurel, a smile playing on her lips. "I don't know. Something more austere, I suppose." The Vermont countryside seems simple at first glance, but it hides an incredible complexity. It's one of the oldest and most balanced ecosystems in America. Each maple tree is a world unto itself. Woodstock finally appeared, a collection of colonial houses clustered around a church whose steeple dominated the landscape. The stone streets forced Elliot to reduce his speed, while curious glances followed the luxury vehicle. Such car visits weren't frequent. Laurel's family home, recently renovated thanks to Elliot's generosity, stood out for its freshly painted facade. At the door waited the entire family. Laurel's mother, a small woman with hands hardened by years of quilting. Her father, tall and thin, with skin weathered by the sun and an expression that combined pride and wariness. Her younger brother, a teenager who looked at the car with poorly disguised admiration. The embrace between Laurel and her mother was long and intense. Elliot observed the scene with a pang of something like envy. In his world, demonstrations of affection were measured, controlled, almost procedural. "So you're the famous Elliot," said the father, extending a calloused hand, "the man who took our daughter to the big city." "Dad," warned Laurel. "I'm just stating facts," replied the man with a tense smile. "Come in, the food's ready." The house was modest but welcoming. The renovation had respected the essence of the place, adding comforts without altering its character. In the dining room, a large table occupied the center, covered with a hand-quilted tablecloth. The aromas emanating from the kitchen made Elliot's stomach growl, reminding him that he hadn't eaten breakfast. The meal progressed in an initially tense atmosphere that gradually relaxed. Laurel's mother, overcoming her initial shyness, turned out to be an enthusiastic conversationalist who gently interrogated Elliot about his life in New York. Her father, after several glasses of local hard cider, began to tell stories from Laurel's childhood. "She was always different," he explained, with barely disguised pride. While other girls played with dolls, she would escape to the fields with her notebooks. She'd return covered in dust with fingers stained with ink but with bright eyes. We always knew she wouldn't stay in town forever. "Dad's exaggerating," interjected Laurel, visibly uncomfortable. "I was never that special." "Weren't you?" The man turned to Elliot. At 12, she won a state drawing contest, competing against high school students. Her drawing of the countryside in the rain was displayed at the Burlington Town Hall for months. Elliot observed Laurel, surprised. She had never mentioned this contest. In fact, he realized he knew very little about her life before New York. He had been so busy transforming her that he had never taken the time to really know her story. After lunch, Laurel proposed a walk. She guided him through narrow streets where neighbors greeted them with a familiarity impossible to find in New York. Finally, they reached a small square with a central fountain. "I used to sit here to draw when I was a child," she explained, pointing to a stone bench weathered by time. "I came every afternoon after school." They sat in silence, contemplating the water that flowed from the fountain with a constant, relaxing murmur. "Why did you never tell me about the contest you won?" Elliot finally asked. Laurel shrugged, a shadow crossing her face. "It didn't seem important. It didn't fit the image we were constructing." "The image I was constructing, you mean?" She didn't respond immediately. Her fingers played with the edge of the bench, tracing invisible patterns on the stone. "My first marriage was a disaster," Elliot said suddenly, surprising himself with the confession. "Meredith was like you, authentic, vibrant, full of life. I met her when she was working as a waitress to pay for her architecture studies." Laurel looked at him. disconcerted by this turn in the conversation. "What happened?" "I transformed her." His voice sounded hollow. "Not suddenly, but little by little. Each gift, each suggestion, each opportunity I offered shaped her. She changed her way of dressing, of speaking, even her ambitions. She abandoned architecture to become the perfect wife for a rising businessman. And when I succeeded, when I finally turned her into the porcelain doll I thought I needed, I realized I had destroyed everything I loved about her." The words floated between them, heavy as stones. "Why are you telling me this now?" asked Laurel. Elliot took her hand, looking at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Because I'm terrified of making the same mistake with you." Back in New York, something had changed. It wasn't a visible or easily definable change, but a subtle alteration in the atmosphere between them, like when the barometric pressure drops before a storm. The apartment, with its minimalist elegance and impressive views, now seemed an artificial stage where both played increasingly uncomfortable roles. Elliot observed Laurel as she contemplated the city from the window, her silhouette outlined against the New York sunset. She had recovered some of her previous habits. She no longer spent hours in beauty sessions, had returned to wearing her old jeans when at home, and most significantly, had resumed drawing with feverish intensity. The studio he had set up in the penthouse, previously barely used, had become her refuge. She spent hours there, sometimes entire days, emerging only to eat something quick or sleep a few hours. Elliot respected that space, instinctively understanding that it was vital for her, but he couldn't help feeling some apprehension about what she was creating there, behind closed doors. "I'd like to see your new work," he finally said one night, while they shared a silent dinner. Laurel raised her eyes from her plate, studying him with an expression he couldn't interpret. "They're different," she replied after a pause. "I don't know if you'll like them." "It's not about whether I like them. I want to understand what you're working on." The tension that crossed her face was barely perceptible, but he noticed it. "All right, I'll show you tomorrow." The next morning, Elliot entered the studio for the first time in weeks. The space had been transformed. The neat art materials he had bought, previously organized with almost clinical precision, were now dispersed in a creative chaos. Sketches covered the walls, some torn halfway through, others superimposed. The floor was stained with paint, and the smell of oil and turpentine permeated the air. But what caught his full attention were the canvases propped against the walls. 10, perhaps 12, large-format works that seemed to pulsate with an almost violent energy. These weren't the bucolic scenes of the Vermont countryside she used to draw. These pieces explored the tension between two worlds, fragmented compositions where the ochre of Vermont earth intertwined with the gray of urban concrete, female figures trapped in impossible transitions, spaces that simultaneously opposed and complemented each other. One piece in particular left him breathless. A woman, clearly Laurel, though her face appeared diffuse, was divided exactly in half. One side wore simple clothes and was surrounded by rural elements, maple trees, red earth, a distant church steeple. The other side wore elegant clothes and was situated among glass and steel skyscrapers. But the most striking thing was that the figure didn't seem torn by this duality, but rather began to integrate it. Her arms extended toward both sides, as if wanting to embrace them. "They're extraordinary," murmured Elliot, genuinely impressed. "They're honest," replied Laurel, who had remained silent, observing his reaction. "For the first time in months I'm painting what I really feel, not what I think I should feel." Elliot approached another canvas, where ghostly figures with aristocratic features surrounded a young woman with her back turned, their hands stretched toward her, as if wanting to mold her. "I suppose that's me and my world, right?" he asked with a sad smile. "It's not that literal," she replied, though they both knew it partly was. "It's about expectations, about how sometimes we let ourselves be defined by others' gaze." A dense silence ensued, laden with unasked questions and half-acknowledged truths. "What do you want to do with these works?" Elliot finally asked. "I don't know. I wasn't even sure about showing them to you." "You should exhibit them." The surprise on Laurel's face was evident. "Are you serious?" "They're not the type of decorative art your contacts usually appreciate." Precisely because of that, Elliot approached, taking her hands. "These pieces aren't decoration. They're a statement. Powerful, visceral, authentic." Something changed in Laurel's gaze, a spark of hope mixed with caution. "What if I ask you not to intervene, to let me handle the exhibition in my own way, without your contacts, without your influence?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Elliot felt an initial impulse to reject the idea. After all, his contacts could guarantee success. But he restrained himself, recognizing what was really at stake: Laurel's trust, her autonomy, her right to define her own path. "If that's what you want, I'll respect it," he finally responded. "Though I don't understand why you'd reject an advantage." "Because I need to know if I can do it by myself," she interrupted with new firmness in her voice. "If my work has its own value, not as Elliot Harrington's protégé." He nodded slowly, understanding they were reaching a turning point in their relationship. What happened from now on would determine whether they would move forward together or take separate paths. "Agreed, it will be as you wish." Laurel smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her face in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank you. It means a lot to me." That night, as Laurel slept, Elliot remained awake contemplating the bedroom ceiling. The conversation in the studio had awakened memories he had been repressing for years. His own struggle between being and seeming, his abandoned dreams, the concessions made in the name of success. He remembered the drawings he had made in his childhood, before family pressure oriented him toward business. The simple pleasure of creating something from scratch, without worrying about its market value or social acceptance. The freedom he had sacrificed on the altar of others' expectations. And for the first time in decades, he wondered if it wasn't too late to recover something of the boy he once was. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this is the type of work our gallery represents," said the woman with a professionally courteous smile, returning the portfolio to Laurel. "It's too intense for our audience." It was the third gallery she had visited that week, and the third similar response. All appreciated the technical strength and conceptual originality of her work, but none seemed willing to take a chance on an unknown artist whose work didn't easily fit into established commercial categories. Laurel went out to the street, feeling the weight of rejection like a stone in her stomach. The June sun fell mercilessly on New York, turning the asphalt into an almost liquid surface that reverberated heat. She sat on a bench in Washington Square Park, observing tourists who strolled carelessly, oblivious to her growing desperation. A month had passed since she decided to seek an exhibition on her own, rejecting Elliot's help. A month of politely closed doors, of empty compliments followed by "but," of condescending looks that seemed to say, "Did you really think it would be so easy?" Her phone vibrated. A message from Elliot. How did it go? She hesitated before responding. Pride prevented her from admitting that perhaps she had overestimated her possibilities, that the art world in New York was a hermetic circle where surnames and connections weighed as much as talent. "Still looking," she finally wrote, putting the phone away without waiting for a response. The reality was that money was beginning to run short. She had insisted on paying for all expenses related to the exhibition herself, the transport of the works, the printing of the portfolio, even the rental of a small storage space where she kept her canvases to keep them separate from the apartment she shared with Elliot. A symbolic act of independence that now seemed reckless. She returned to the apartment as dusk fell. Elliot wasn't there, probably detained in some business meeting. The solitude of the space, with its cold, calculated elegance, suddenly felt oppressive. Almost without thinking, she took her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in weeks. "Ren, it's me. Can you talk?" The familiar voice of her friend, with her closed Vermont accent and her unmistakable enthusiasm, was like a balm. "Laurel! Finally a sign of life! Your mother is worried, says you hardly call lately." Guilt added to the cocktail of emotions already bubbling inside her. "I know, I'm sorry. I've been busy." "Busy or avoiding us?" Ren's tone was light, but Laurel detected the underlying concern. "A bit of both, I suppose." She let herself fall onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. "Things aren't going as I expected." During the next hour, she poured out all her frustrations. The fruitless search for a gallery, the growing sensation of being an imposter in both worlds, too refined now for Woodstock, still too provincial for the New York elite, the fear of disappointing Elliot, her parents, herself. "Maybe I should give up," she concluded with a broken voice. "Accept Elliot's help. Let him use his contacts. And then what? Wren's voice sounded unusually serious. Go back to being the little doll he shows off in society. I've known you since we wore pigtails, Laurel. You've never let anyone determine your worth. Don't start now. After hanging up, Laurel remained motionless on the sofa, her friend's words resonating in her mind. The main door opened, announcing Elliot's arrival. I brought you something, he said, placing a small package on the table. A detail I saw that reminded me of you. It was a miniature reproduction of a maple tree, carved in olive wood, so detailed that the tiny leaves seemed distinguishable. It's beautiful, murmured Laurel, touching the figure with trembling fingers. Are you okay? Elliot sat beside her, perceiving her mood. You look exhausted. Laurel hesitated for a moment. It would be so easy to lie, keep her pride intact, pretend that everything was going according to plan. But she was tired of appearances, of half-truths, of pretending to be who she wasn't. I'm not okay, she finally admitted. No gallery wants my work. I've spent almost all my savings. And the worst is that I'm beginning to doubt myself, my art, whether I really have something valuable to offer, or if I'm just a small-town girl with pretensions. The tears she had been holding back all day finally overflowed. Elliot drew her to him, allowing her to cry against his impeccable shirt, probably ruining the Italian fabric, but for once that didn't matter. I've never doubted your talent, he said when the sobs subsided. Not for a second. Then why can't anyone else see it? She asked, drying her tears with the back of her hand, in a gesture that recalled the Laurel of before, the one who didn't worry about smeared makeup or appearances. Because art is subjective, and the art market even more so. It's not about quality, but about trends, connections, the right moment. That means you were right, that I need your help, your contacts. Elliot was silent for a moment, carefully considering his words. I think there's a difference between accepting help and renouncing your autonomy. I can introduce you to people who might be interested in your work, but the final decision about what to exhibit and how to do it would remain completely yours. Laurel separated slightly, studying his face. Are you serious? Completely. He held her gaze. I've learned something important in these months, Laurel. That loving you means respecting your independence, not absorbing it. That night, after a simple dinner, the first they cooked together in the apartment, a humble but delicious maple-glazed pork tenderloin that reminded her of Vermont cuisine, Laurel felt something lighten inside her. The sensation of free fall that had tormented her for weeks transformed into something different. It wasn't that she had stopped falling, but now she trusted there would be something, or someone, to cushion the impact. As she fell asleep in Elliot's arms, she thought of the maple trees in the Vermont fields, with their deep roots that allow them to survive droughts and fires. Perhaps that's what she needed, not to cut her roots to fly higher, but to deepen them to grow stronger. Breakfast at Harrington Manor was always a ritual. Impeccably ironed damask tablecloths, Limoges porcelain, silver cutlery with the family crest engraved, and servants who moved with the silent precision of trained shadows. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, widow of the influential banker Nathaniel Harrington, presided over the table like one directing an orchestra, each gesture measured, each word calculated, her posture perfectly straight, despite her 78 years. Elliot invariably felt like a teenager in her presence, despite his 41 years and his own considerable success. He had accepted the invitation to breakfast. It's not an invitation, Elliot, it's a summons, he had bitterly joked with Laurel, knowing perfectly well that his mother would want to talk about his relationship. The project in Williamsburg seems to be going swimmingly, commented Mrs. Harrington, taking a small sip of her Earl Grey tea. Albright mentioned to me that they've sold almost all the penthouses before even beginning construction. The pre-sales have exceeded our expectations, confirmed Elliot, grateful for the start with business topics. The luxury real estate market continues to be buoyant despite the naysayers. You've always had a good eye for opportunities. The woman paused, placing her cup on the saucer with millimetric precision. Speaking of opportunities, I've been told that your friendship with that young artist continues. There it was, the real reason for breakfast wrapped in apparent casualness. Laurel. Elliot pronounced the name with deliberate clarity. And it's not a friendship, Mother, it's a serious relationship. Mrs. Harrington slightly pressed her lips, the only visible indication of her disapproval. You've been saying the same thing for almost a year, dear. I'm starting to wonder if it isn't simply a prolonged phase. Like that time you took up collecting vintage motorcycles, Elliot felt the familiar combination of irritation and vulnerability that only his mother managed to provoke. Laurel is not a motorcycle, nor a phase. She's the woman with whom I want to share my life. A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the tinkling of the teaspoon against the porcelain as Mrs. Harrington added more sugar to her tea. Quite a definitive statement, she finally said. Have you considered the implications? Not just for you, but for the surname you represent. The Harrington name was built by my father from scratch, without any aristocratic title backing it, replied Elliot, intentionally touching a sensitive point. Or perhaps you're referring to the Abbott surname, which, as I recall, comes from great-grandparents who traded textiles in Boston. A flash of anger crossed the woman's eyes, quickly controlled. It's not a question of titles, but of world, of education, of shared codes, of understanding how certain circles function. Your Laurel may be charming, I don't doubt, but do you really believe she can adapt to our environment? Or do you intend to adapt to hers? Do you imagine spending summers in a small Vermont town instead of the Hamptons? It might be refreshing, replied Elliot, though the mental image produced an uncomfortable sensation of doubt. And you underestimate Laurel. She's intelligent, sensitive, has extraordinary talent as an artist. I don't doubt it. Mrs. Harrington softened her tone. But there's a difference between admiring someone and sharing a life. The differences that now seem picturesque can turn into abysses with time. Elliot remembered the words he had confessed to Laurel about his first failed marriage, about how he had transformed Meredith until she was unrecognizable. The irony didn't escape him. Then he had tried to mold his wife to fit into this world. Now his mother was warning him about the dangers of a woman who didn't belong to it. You're projecting your own prejudices, Mother, he said, with a calmness he didn't feel. The world has changed. The circles that concern you so much no longer have the relevance they had in your time. Mrs. Harrington smiled indulgently, like someone observing a child make an adorably naive statement. New money always believes that, dear, until they need to open certain doors that remain closed without the right connections. The conversation drifted toward more neutral topics. The recent exhibition at the Met, the wedding of common friends' children, plans for the summer. But the poison had already been injected, subtle but effective, and Elliot felt it circulating in his veins as he drove back to the city center. What if his mother was right? Not in her blatant elitism, of course, but in the underlying concern. What if the differences between him and Laurel, now manageable in the enthusiasm of a relatively new relationship, became sources of resentment over time? What if she never felt completely comfortable in his world? Or worse yet, if he never managed to adapt to hers? He recalled the discomfort he had felt in the small town, surrounded by people whose lives and concerns seemed so alien to him. He also remembered how Laurel had shone there, recovering a vitality that seemed to slowly fade in New York. Doubt, once sown, took root with alarming ease. When he arrived at the apartment, he found Laurel in the studio working on a new canvas. Her hair was carelessly tied up, paint stains on her face and on the old t-shirt she used for painting. She had never seemed more beautiful to him, nor more unreachable. "How was it with the matriarch?" she asked without taking her eyes off her work, an ironic smile playing on her lips. As expected, Elliot leaned on the doorframe observing her, concerned about lineage, the right connections, appearances. In other words, she doesn't approve of her son mixing with the common folk. The joke contained an edge of truth that cut the air between them. "It's not that simple," he replied, surprising himself with the implicit defense. Laurel put down the brush, turning to look at him directly. "Isn't it? It seems pretty clear from where I stand. It's complicated. My mother comes from a generation and an environment where social divisions were more defined. The divisions are still there, Elliot. They just disguise themselves better now." Laurel cleaned her hands on a rag, leaving cobalt blue stains. "You know, sometimes I wonder if we can really overcome this. Not just your mother's disapproval, but everything it represents." Elliot felt something cold settle in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we come from different worlds, and no matter how hard I try, I'll never completely belong to yours. And no matter how hard you try, you'll never feel entirely comfortable in mine." There it was, expressed out loud, the same fear that had accompanied him throughout the journey from his mother's house. "I thought we were building something new together," he said, approaching her. "A middle ground where we both could exist." Laurel looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. "That sounds beautiful in theory, but in practice, where is that middle ground? In what part of New York? With which friends? Under what rules?" The questions floated between them, like birds trapped in a closed room, desperately seeking a way out. "I'm pregnant." The words, pronounced without preamble as Elliot reviewed some blueprints in his study, fell like stones in until then calm waters. He looked up, the pen suspended in the air, his mind processing the information with unusual slowness. "What did you say?" "That I'm pregnant." Laurel remained standing in the threshold, a slender figure silhouetted against the corridor light. 6 weeks, according to the doctor. Elliot stood up, dropping the pen. A whirlwind of contradictory emotions invaded him: surprise, joy, fear, vertigo at the implications. "Are you sure?" he asked stupidly, taking a step toward her. "Quite. Unless 3 home tests and a blood test are all wrong." Laurel sketched a tense smile, but her eyes revealed her own confusion. They met in the middle of the room, separated by barely a meter that seemed like an abyss. Elliot tried to decipher her expression, looking for clues about how he should react. Was she happy? Scared? Regretful? "How do you feel?" he finally asked. "I don't know." The honesty in her response was almost painful. Surprised, mainly. "It wasn't in my plans. At least, not now, not yet." "Nor in mine," he admitted, then quickly added, "But that doesn't mean it's not good news." "Is it?" The question hung suspended between them, loaded with all the doubts and insecurities that had been accumulating for months. The conversation with Mrs. Harrington about irreconcilable differences, the galleries that continued to reject Laurel's work, despite the contacts Elliot had discreetly mobilized, the growing sensation of living in a limbo, neither completely in one world nor the other. "I think it could be," he finally responded, taking Laurel's hands, "if it's what we both want." She squeezed his hands, but didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was lost beyond him, toward the window that offered a panoramic view of New York. "You know what's strangest? When I saw the positive result, my first thought wasn't about us or about the baby. It was about my parents. I wondered what they would think, how they would react to knowing their daughter is pregnant without being married." Elliot felt a pang of guilt. Despite all his personal evolution over the past months, he had never seriously considered marriage. The idea of formalizing his relationship with Laurel before the law or the church simply hadn't entered his equation. "We could get married," he suggested, the words escaping his mouth before he could fully consider their implication. Laurel looked at him with an impossible-to-decipher expression. "Is that how you want to propose to me? As a solution to a problem?" "No, I didn't." Elliot ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. "I said it wrong. It's not because of the pregnancy. It's because I love you. Because I want to build a life with you." "Are you sure?" Laurel's voice softened. "Because sometimes I have the feeling we're playing at building sandcastles, waiting for the tide not to destroy them." That night, lying in the darkness but not touching, both contemplated the ceiling as if they could find answers in the shadows cast by the city lights. "What do you want to do?" Elliot finally asked, referring not just to the pregnancy but to everything. Their relationship, their future, the seemingly irreconcilable worlds they were trying to unite. "I don't know." Laurel turned toward him, her profile barely visible in the dimness. "Part of me is terrified, not just about the baby but about everything it implies. Where would we live? How would we raise it? Between what values? We could find a middle ground. We always come back to that mythical middle ground." There was a hint of bitterness in her voice, "but we never really find it. We continue oscillating between your world and mine, without completely belonging to either." Silence settled between them again, heavy and oppressive. "Maybe I should leave for a while," Laurel suddenly said. "Go back to Woodstock, clear my mind." Elliot felt something freeze inside him. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know. I just know I need space to think, away from all this." She made a vague gesture that encompassed the luxurious bedroom, the apartment, the world he represented. "I need to remember who I really am. And us? The baby? I'm not making any definitive decisions now. I just need time." Elliot wanted to protest, to argue that running away wouldn't solve anything, that they should face this challenge together as they had faced others. But a part of him understood her need. Hadn't he himself felt that disconnection, that sensation of playing a role in an increasingly less convincing play? "All right," he finally conceded, "if that's what you need." Laurel left 2 days later, with a small suitcase and the promise to call. The apartment, suddenly empty, seemed to expand to unbearable dimensions. Elliot immersed himself in work, spending entire days at the office, avoiding returning to a space where every corner reminded him of her. The studio with the canvases half finished, the kitchen where they had prepared clumsy but laughter-filled meals, the sofa where they used to cuddle to watch classic films she had never seen. A week later, while mechanically reviewing contracts in his office, he received a call from an unknown number. "Mr. Harrington? I'm Imogen Wells from the Mirror Gallery in Chelsea. I'd like to talk to you about an emerging artist whose work has greatly impressed me." Laurel Clark. Elliot felt the air leave his lungs. "Do you know her work?" he asked cautiously. "I discovered it by chance on Instagram. Her pieces about the duality between the rural and urban are extraordinary. They have a visceral honesty rarely found in such young artists." Instagram. Elliot couldn't hide his surprise. Laurel barely used social media. "Yes, a friend of hers shared some images. Ren, I think she's called. I immediately contacted the artist to see more of her work. The irony was almost poetic. After months of rejection by prestigious galleries, after all the influence he had tried to discreetly exercise, it had been Ren, the friend he had considered too provincial for his world, who had achieved what he couldn't. "And what did you think?" he asked, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "We want to offer her a solo exhibition. Her vision is unique and powerful. We believe it could make a significant impact on the New York art scene." When he hung up, Elliot remained motionless in his chair, contemplating the views of New York that extended below his window. The city he had always considered his own, his conquered territory, now seemed like an alien landscape. He realized, with a sudden and painful clarity, that perhaps he had been wrong all this time. It wasn't about finding a middle ground between two worlds, nor about helping Laurel adapt to his. It was about allowing each to exist fully in their own authenticity and finding a way for those authenticities to complement rather than compete. The question was, would he be capable of shedding decades of conditioning, of internalized expectations, to embrace a completely new way of understanding success, relationships, and himself? That night, instead of returning to the empty apartment, he drove to Woodstock, the 4-hour trip passing like a feverish dream as he tried to order his thoughts and emotions. Dawn found Elliot sitting in the town square, on the same stone bench where they had talked months ago. The central fountain gurgled softly, the sound of water mixing with the first bird songs. He had arrived in the middle of the night, too late to present himself at the home of Laurel's parents, so he had slept in the car, waking with the first ray of sun and the sounds of the town coming to life. He didn't have a concrete plan. For the first time in his adult life, Elliot Harrington, the man who planned billion-dollar real estate developments with millimetric precision, was improvising. He only knew he needed to see Laurel, talk to her face-to-face in neutral territory, or rather in her territory, where she could be completely authentic. The town was beginning to wake up. A baker crossed the square carrying baskets of freshly baked bread. An old man took his dog for a walk. Some workers were already heading to the fields. Elliot, with his wrinkled suit after spending the night in the car, attracted curious but discreet glances, the Vermont Reserve avoiding direct questions. Finally, when the sun was already warming the square, he took his phone and called. "Elliot!" Laurel's voice sounded surprised. "Where are you?" "It's 7 in the morning." "In the town square, on the stone bench by the fountain." An astonished silence followed his statement. "You're in Woodstock, right now?" "Yes. I arrived last night, late, slept in the car. Why didn't—" "Never mind." He could hear movement on the other end of the line. "Give me 10 minutes." She appeared in the square exactly 8 minutes later, wearing worn jeans and a simple blouse, her hair carelessly tied back. She wore no makeup, and Elliot thought he had never seen her more beautiful, more herself. She stopped a few meters from the bench, studying him with a mixture of surprise and caution. "You look terrible," she finally said, a tentative smile curving her lips. I feel worse, he admitted, standing up. But that doesn't matter now. Why did you come, Elliot? Because the Mirror Gallery wants to offer you a solo exhibition. It wasn't what he had planned to say, but the words came out before he could stop them. Surprise transformed Laurel's face. How do you know? The gallery owner called me yesterday looking for you. Apparently Ren shared your work on Instagram and they discovered it there. They loved your vision, your honesty. They want to exhibit you immediately. Ren? Laurel shook her head, between amused and moved. She's always believed in me more than I believed in myself. And she was right. Elliot took a step toward her. But that doesn't answer your question. I didn't just come to give you the news. I came because I realized something important. What? That I've been wrong all this time. I thought it was about helping you fit into my world, or finding a compromise between the two. But now I understand that it's about something completely different. It's about each of us being authentically who we are, and discovering how those authenticities can complement rather than compete. Laurel observed him intently, her eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions. Beautiful words. But I don't know if they're enough, Elliot. We have a real problem here. I know, and I don't pretend that a sudden epiphany will solve everything. I just want you to know that I'm willing to change for real, not superficially, to question everything I took for granted about success status, even about who I am. And the baby? The question was direct, almost brutal in its simplicity. I want to be this child's father. Elliot didn't hesitate. With you. As a family, whatever form that family takes. She remained silent, but something had changed in her posture, a tension that was beginning to dissolve. There's something else you should know, she finally said. I've been drawing a lot these days, and I've made a decision. I'm going to accept the exhibition at the Mirror, but I also want to maintain my roots here. I'm considering dividing my time between New York and Woodstock. Elliot felt a wave of relief. It wasn't a definitive rejection, but a proposal, a possible solution. It could work. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. Laurel smiled, a genuine smile this time. You're a mess. Come on, let's go home. My mother must be preparing breakfast. They walked together through the town, the first sun rays casting long shadows in front of them. They didn't hold hands, maintaining a prudent distance that reflected the fragility of the moment, but there was a new complicity between them, a silent understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, they had found a way forward. Breakfast with Laurel's family was surprisingly warm. Although initially disconcerted by Elliot's sudden appearance, her parents showed a genuine hospitality that deeply moved him. There was no protocol or pretense, just chipped mugs overflowing with coffee, freshly baked bread with maple syrup, spontaneous laughter, and conversations that flowed naturally. So they want to exhibit our girl's drawings in New York, commented the father, with barely disguised pride. I always knew she would go far. They're much more than drawings, they're powerful works of art, replied Elliot sincerely. Laurel has a unique vision, a way of capturing the tension between worlds that is extraordinary. He looked at Laurel as he spoke, and she returned his gaze, a silent communication passing between them. They hadn't talked about the pregnancy with her parents yet, both aware that they needed to clarify their own relationship first. After breakfast, Laurel took him to her favorite place in town, a small hill from which the whole of Woodstock and the surrounding countryside could be seen, century-old maple trees stretching as far as the eye could reach. I used to come here when I needed to think, she explained, sitting on a flat rock, when I felt the town was too small for me, that there was a whole world out there waiting to be discovered. And now? Asked Elliot, sitting beside her. Now I understand that it's not about choosing between worlds, it's about taking your roots with you wherever you go. She paused, her hands instinctively resting on her belly. I want our child to know both worlds, the countryside and the skyscrapers, the century-old maple trees and the avant-garde museums. I want them to understand that wealth isn't just measured in dollars, but also in human connections, in authenticity, in belonging. Elliot felt something loosen in his chest, a tension that had been present for so long, he had forgotten what it was like to live without it. I'd like that too, he said softly, and I want to be part of it, if you'll let me. Laurel looked at him for a long time, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. You'll have to prove it with actions, not just with beautiful words said in an emotional moment. I know, and I'm willing to do it. For you, for the baby, but also for myself. Because I've realized that I've spent too much time living the life others expected of me, instead of the one I really want. The sun shone on the countryside, illuminating the maple trees with a golden light that seemed to transform the landscape into something almost magical. In that moment, under that infinite Vermont sky, both felt that perhaps, just perhaps, they had taken the first true step toward reconciling their worlds. The Mirror Gallery, located in the heart of Chelsea, was smaller than Laurel had imagined, but it compensated with a minimalist design and exquisite lighting that enhanced each piece. Her works, 15 in total, occupied all the walls of the space, creating a visual journey that narrated her personal and artistic evolution. "It's perfect," she murmured, contemplating the final arrangement the night before the opening. Imogen Wells, the gallery owner, smiled with satisfaction. "Your work speaks for itself. We've just provided the appropriate stage." Laurel slowly toured the space, stopping in front of each piece. The first works, created during her initial months in New York, showed the tension and bewilderment of finding herself between two worlds. Torn figures, fragmented landscapes, a palpable sense of disorientation in each stroke. The central pieces, created during her crisis and subsequent rediscovery, reflected a more intense, almost desperate search for identity. The contrasts were more pronounced. The red earth of Vermont against the grey asphalt of New York, rural simplicity versus urban complexity, deep roots versus newly spread wings. And finally, the most recent works, painted during her stay in Woodstock after Eliot's surprise visit, showed a notable change. There was no longer tearing, but integration. The figures weren't divided between worlds, but existed simultaneously in both, creating bridges, extending threads of connection. The last piece, strategically located at the end of the journey, was particularly powerful. Simply titled Roots and Wings, it showed two figures, clearly her and Eliot, holding between them a small bright light, a barely veiled symbol of the new life growing inside her. "It's my favorite," said a voice behind her. Eliot had approached silently, elegant but discreet in a dark suit he had deliberately chosen not to draw attention. Tonight wasn't about him, his connections or his surname. It was about Laurel and her art. "I painted it after our conversation on the hill," she explained, "when I finally saw a possible future, a way forward." He took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" "Terrified." Laurel smiled, but there was a genuine vulnerability in her eyes. "It's the first time my work will be displayed like this for anyone to judge. Your work is extraordinary. It speaks honestly about an experience many can recognize, feeling caught between worlds, seeking a place of one's own. It will resonate with people." She nodded, though apprehension didn't completely leave her gaze. "What if your mother comes? I know you invited her." Eliot had indeed sent a formal invitation to Mrs. Harrington. He didn't expect her to attend. His mother rarely appeared at cultural events outside the most established circuit, but it had seemed important to make the gesture. "If she comes, she'll see the extraordinary talent of the woman I love. And if she doesn't recognize it, it will be her loss, not yours." On the opening night, the gallery filled quickly. To Laurel's surprise and joy, her entire family had traveled from Woodstock. Her parents, visibly uncomfortable but proud in their best clothes. Her younger brother, fascinated by the New York art scene. Wren, radiant in a dress bought especially for the occasion, presuming to anyone who would listen to be Laurel's discoverer. Art critics from important media outlets, the New York Times, the New Yorker, specialized magazines, toured the exhibition with expressions of genuine interest. Discreet but influential collectors asked questions about prices and availability. Young artists observed the works with a mixture of admiration and recognition, identifying with the struggle for authenticity that they portrayed. Eliot deliberately kept himself in the background, allowing Laurel to shine on her own merit. He observed her from a distance as she explained her creative process to a group of enthusiasts, her face animated, her hands drawing shapes in the air, completely in her element. "So this is your famous artist?" The voice behind him startled him. Mrs. Harrington, impeccably elegant in a Chanel ensemble, held a champagne flute with studied indifference. "Mother, I didn't expect to see you here. Curiosity won out over good sense, I suppose. The woman surveyed the space with an evaluative look. I must admit she has talent. There's a rawness in her work that is impactful. Elliot held back a smile. Coming from his mother, it was almost an overflowing compliment. She's honest. She paints what she feels, not what she thinks she should paint. A quality uncommon in our circles, certainly. Mrs. Harrington observed Laurel, who now conversed animatedly with an art critic known for his severity. She seems to have adapted well to the environment. She hasn't adapted, corrected Elliot. She's remained true to herself, and the environment has recognized her value. His mother looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and something like respect. You've changed, Elliot. We all change, Mother. Sometimes for the better. Imogen Wells approached them, her face reflecting a barely contained professional satisfaction. The exhibition is an absolute success. We've sold 8 pieces in the first hour, including the central work to an important American collector, and the Times wants to do an in-depth interview for their Sunday Arts supplement. Elliot nodded, genuinely pleased, but not surprised. He had always believed in Laurel's talent, even when he had tried to mold it according to his own expectations. Across the room he saw Laurel looking for him. When their eyes met, she smiled, a smile full of joy, pride, and something more, an invitation. Excusing himself to his mother, he crossed the room toward her. I want to introduce you to someone, said Laurel, taking his hand. This is Marcus Ferreira, art critic for The New Yorker. And these are my parents, Tom and Sarah. The heterogeneous group conversed animatedly, the critic praising the authenticity of Laurel's work, her parents contributing anecdotes about her artistic childhood, Elliot acting as a bridge between worlds that, surprisingly, seemed to find more common ground than expected. At one point, as the conversation flowed around him, Elliot took Laurel's hand and squeezed it slightly. She looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. I'm proud of you, he murmured, not just for the success, but for staying true to yourself despite everything, even despite me. Laurel's smile illuminated her face, completely transforming her. In that moment, Elliot knew with certainty that they had found not a middle ground, but something much more valuable, a space where each could be authentically who they were without needing to diminish or transform themselves. And that night, as the exhibition continued around them, celebrating the art that had been born from the tension and resolution between two worlds, something crystallized in Elliot's heart. A determination not to go back, to build something new, something that honored both deep roots and spread wings. The sunset bathed the countryside with a golden light, transforming the century-old maple trees into majestic silhouettes against a sky transitioning from orange to purple. Elliot contemplated the landscape from the porch of the house, a traditional Vermont construction they had carefully restored over the past 2 months. It wasn't an ostentatious mansion, nor did it pretend to be. It preserved the structure and spirit of the area's rural houses, with white walls, dark wooden beam ceilings, terracotta floors, and a central fireplace that would provide heat during the winters. The only concessions to modernity were invisible: an updated electrical system, quality running water, and an internet connection that allowed Elliot to manage his business remotely when necessary. The property, located 2 kilometers from Woodstock, included 5 hectares of countryside with century-old maple trees, a small apple orchard, and enough space for Laurel to have installed a large art studio in a rehabilitated old barn. They hadn't sold the New York apartment. It was still necessary for their professional commitments in the city, but this house had become, surprisingly for Elliot, the place he most felt like home. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew him from his reflections. Laurel's car appeared on the dirt road, raising a small cloud of reddish dust. She was returning from her medical appointment in Burlington, where they had confirmed that everything was progressing normally with the pregnancy. Elliot descended the steps to receive her, observing how her silhouette, now visibly 6 months pregnant, was outlined against the sunset light. She had never seemed more beautiful to him. How did it go? He asked, helping her out of the car. Perfectly. Laurel smiled, taking his hand to place it on her swollen belly. Your daughter is healthy and growing exactly as she should. Daughter? Elliot felt his heart accelerate. Is it a girl? According to the ultrasound. Laurel took out a black and white image from her bag. Look, here she is. The doctor says she has your profile. Elliot contemplated the blurred image, trying to distinguish recognizable forms in that black and white mystery. He didn't see any resemblance, of course, but the idea that this small life had something of him, of them, produced an overwhelming emotion. "A girl," he repeated, savoring the words. "We're going to have a daughter." They entered the house together, where the temperature was pleasant thanks to the thick walls that kept the coolness despite the external heat. In the kitchen, on the robust wooden table, waited the materials for the project they had planned for that afternoon, painting together the mural for the baby's room. "I've been thinking about the design," said Laurel, unfolding a sketch on the table. A stylized countryside with maple trees, but among them small references to New York, silhouettes of the Empire State Building, the Brooklyn Bridge, Central Park. "What do you think?" "It's perfect." Elliot studied the sketch, admiring how Laurel had managed to integrate elements from both worlds in a harmonious composition, a visual reminder of her roots. As they prepared the materials, Elliot thought about the path traveled over the past year. He remembered their first meeting at that small exhibition in Salem, the months of forced transformation, the inevitable crisis, the painful but necessary mutual rediscovery. "What are you thinking about?" asked Laurel, noticing his reflective expression. "About us. About how we got here. It's been a complicated path," she admitted, mixing a particular shade of blue that recalled the New York sky. "There were moments when I thought we wouldn't make it." "Me too." Elliot took a brush, dipping it in the paint. "Especially when you left for Woodstock. Those days without you were the emptiest of my life. I needed that space, to remember who I was, what I really wanted." Laurel began to trace the outline of a maple tree on the wall. "And I think you needed it too. You're right. It forced me to face truths I had been avoiding for years." They worked in silence for a while, their brushes slowly creating the hybrid landscape they had imagined for their daughter. It was an appropriate metaphor for the life they were building, not a surrender of one world to another, but a conscious integration, a complementarity. "Have you thought about names?" Elliot finally asked as he painted the silhouette of the Empire State Building in miniature, partially hidden among the branches of a maple tree. "I was thinking of roots," joked Laurel, earning a look of feigned horror from Elliot. "Our daughter will hate us forever." "It was a joke," Laurel laughed, accidentally splashing paint on his shirt. "I was thinking of Willow." Elliot considered the name, letting it resonate in his mind. "Willow Harrington Clark. Sounds good. Willow because she'll be like a willow tree, flexible yet strong, with roots deep in the earth and branches reaching for the sky," explained Laurel, her hand momentarily resting on her belly. "A bridge between our lives, our stories." The sun had completely set, and the room was now illuminated by lamps that projected a warm glow on the mural in progress. Outside, the sounds of the nocturnal countryside began, the distant hooting of an owl, the singing of crickets, the whisper of the wind among the maple trees. Elliot put down his brush and took Laurel's hands, stained with paint, as in those first days when he had met her. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, with a seriousness that contrasted with the lightness of the previous moment. "I'm listening. These months together, building this house, preparing for Willow's arrival, they've been the most fulfilling of my life. And I want to ask you if—" The sound of the doorbell interrupted them. They exchanged looks of surprise. They weren't expecting visitors, and the house was isolated enough that casual visits were unlikely. "I'll go see who it is," said Elliot, slightly irritated by the interruption. Upon opening the door, surprise left him momentarily speechless. On the threshold, illuminated by the porch light, stood Mrs. Harrington. "Mother," he finally managed to say, "I didn't know you were coming." "Evidently." The woman looked him up and down, noticing the paint stains on his clothing. "Am I interrupting something?" "We were painting the baby's room." Elliot stepped aside, inviting her in with a gesture. "Please, come in." Mrs. Harrington entered with evident curiosity, her eyes evaluating every detail of the house. Elliot perceived her surprise at finding a space that, though simple, had been restored with good taste and attention to detail. "To what do we owe the honor?" he asked, guiding her to the living room. "I wanted to see this house you talk so much about." And to speak with Laurel. As if he had invoked her, Laurel appeared in the entrance to the living room, also stained with paint, her pregnancy clearly visible under the loose T-shirt. "Mrs. Harrington," she greeted, with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Welcome to our home." "Laurel." The woman slightly inclined her head. I see the pregnancy is progressing well. 6 months already. Everything's going perfectly. An uncomfortable silence ensued, each evaluating the situation, seeking the way forward in this unexpected encounter. Can I offer you something to drink? Laurel finally asked. We have wine, or I can prepare tea. Tea would be nice, thank you. Laurel disappeared toward the kitchen, leaving Elliot alone with his mother. It's a charming house, commented Mrs. Harrington, breaking the silence. Not what I expected, but it has character. We preserved its original essence. The idea was to maintain authenticity, not impose our vision. An interesting philosophy. His mother studied him carefully. You've changed, Elliot, not just in appearance, but in essence. For the better, I hope, he replied, holding her gaze. Different, certainly. More authentic, perhaps. She paused, as if considering her next words. I saw the article in the Times about Laurel's exhibition. Impressive review. It was. And completely deserved. Laurel returned with a tray containing a teapot, cups, and some traditional Vermont pastries. She served the tea with a natural grace that had nothing to do with the etiquette classes she had taken in New York, but with a genuine courtesy learned at home. I wanted to speak with both of you, said Mrs. Harrington, holding her cup with impeccable elegance, about the future, about my granddaughter. Elliot and Laurel exchanged looks of surprise. How do you know it's a girl? Asked Laurel. I have my sources. An enigmatic smile briefly crossed the woman's face. What's important is that I've been reflecting. About family, continuity, what really matters at the end of the day. She took a sip of tea before continuing. I haven't been the most understanding mother, Elliot, nor the most welcoming mother-in-law, Laurel. I belong to a generation with rigid values, established expectations about what constitutes a good marriage, a good life, but age brings certain perspective. What are you trying to say, Mother? That I'm willing to make an effort, to really get to know Laurel, not through the filter of my prejudices, to be part of my granddaughter's life, on your terms, not mine. She paused, something almost vulnerable appearing in her usually imperturbable eyes. If you'll allow me. The declaration floated in the air, surprising in its frankness, unexpected in its humility. Elliot looked at Laurel, letting her be the one to respond. I think Willow deserves to know all her grandparents, Laurel finally said, and to form her own opinion about them. Willow, repeated Mrs. Harrington, savoring the name. It's appropriate. And so under the roof of that house that symbolized the integration of two worlds, perhaps the most unexpected breakthrough occurred, the beginning of a reconciliation that none of those present would have considered possible a year before. Later, when Mrs. Harrington had left, promising to return to meet her granddaughter when she was born, Elliot and Laurel returned to the baby's room to contemplate the half-finished mural. I think we should add a small mansion over here, suggested Laurel, indicating a corner of the mural, to represent that part of her heritage too. Elliot embraced her from behind, his hands finding the belly where their daughter grew. I was interrupted earlier, he murmured against her hair. I was going to ask you something important. Laurel turned to look at him. I'm listening. Elliot took her paint-stained hands, so similar to the hands of the young woman he had met at that exhibition in Salem, but now marked by new experiences, by a shared growth. Laurel Clark, would you do me the honor of marrying me? Not for social conventions nor for the baby, but because I want to share my life with you in all the worlds we inhabit. Laurel's smile illuminated the room more than any lamp. Yes, she simply responded. In all the worlds. And under the gaze of the painted maple trees and the New York buildings beginning to take shape in the mural, they sealed their commitment with a kiss that tasted of paint, tea, and a future where roots and wings didn't compete but mutually strengthened each other. The September sun caressed the Vermont countryside with a golden light that transformed each maple tree into a living sculpture. Under the shade of one of them, particularly old and majestic, a long wooden table had been arranged, covered with a hand-embroidered white tablecloth. Traditional ceramic plates and cut crystal glasses reflected the changing light, while simple vases overflowed with wildflowers collected that very morning. It was a special day, Willow's first birthday and Elliot and Laurel's first wedding anniversary. The celebration had been Laurel's idea, to join both events in an intimate party, that would gather the most important people in their lives, not in an elegant New York salon nor in the town, but in the countryside they had converted into their true home, the exact point where their worlds met. Around the table, a heterogeneous group conversed animatedly. Laurel's parents, now completely comfortable with their son-in-law, shared anecdotes about their daughter's childhood with Elliot's New York friends, executives and artists who had discovered the pleasure of rural simplicity. Wren, with her usual enthusiasm, showed photographs of Laurel's latest exhibition in Boston to Imogen Wells, the gallery owner who had launched her career and now had become a close friend. Mrs. Harrington, elegant as always but notably more relaxed, held her granddaughter in her arms, whispering stories about her ancestors, adding her own thread to the tapestry of identity they were weaving for her. Willow, with her dark hair and curious eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the world around her, passed from arm to arm, receiving kisses and blessings, small gifts and grand promises. She was a quiet but alert child, with a smile that illuminated her face when she recognized familiar voices or discovered something new. Elliot observed the scene from a certain distance, leaning against the trunk of another maple tree, marveling at the path life had taken. If someone had told him 3 years ago that he would find his greatest happiness not in glass and steel skyscrapers, but under century-old maple trees, with a daughter who had red earth on her knees, and a wife whose authenticity had redefined his understanding of success, he would probably have laughed with incredulity. "What are you thinking about?" Laurel approached silently, intertwining her hand with his. "About how things change," he replied, drawing her to him. "About how we got here." Laurel followed his gaze to the table, where worlds that once seemed irreconcilable now coexisted harmoniously. Her father conversed animatedly with one of Elliot's partners about traditional farming techniques that could be applied to sustainable agriculture. Her mother was teaching a New York fashion designer the intricate patterns of Vermont quilting that had been passed down from generation to generation. Mrs. Harrington laughed openly at something Wren said, the same friend whose presence in the New York apartment had caused so much discontent at the beginning. "I think we've created something beautiful here," murmured Laurel, resting her head on his shoulder. "Not just a family, but a space where different realities can coexist without competing." "We have." Elliot kissed her forehead. "And it all began with your courage to be authentic, to not allow yourself to be molded into something you weren't, and with your willingness to question your own certainties, to rediscover parts of yourself that you had abandoned long ago." From the table came the sound of laughter. Willow had grabbed a handful of earth and spread it on the white tablecloth, to the feigned consternation of the adults and her own evident delight. "She's a true mixture of us," commented Elliot with pride. "She has your creativity and my tendency to ignore conventions when they don't make sense." Laurel laughed, remembering how Elliot, the man who had once been obsessed with the perfect image, was now the first to throw himself on the ground to play with Willow, not caring about staining his designer pants. "You know what's most incredible?" she said, her voice softening. "That we didn't have to give up anything essential. We simply learned to integrate, not to choose." It was true, they still maintained the New York apartment, where they spent approximately half their time when professional commitments required it. Elliot continued to direct his real estate company, though he had reduced his workload and delegated responsibilities to have more time for his family. Laurel continued to exhibit in prestigious galleries, her artistic career flourishing under the protective wing of Imogen Wells, who had known how to present her work exactly as it was, a bridge between worlds, an honest exploration of the tension between roots and wings. But their true home, the place where both felt they could be completely authentic, was this house in the countryside, where Willow was growing up with earth under her nails and stars over her head, but also with access to the cultural richness and opportunities that the city could offer. "We should go back," suggested Elliot, indicating the table where Willow was now passing into the arms of her grandmother Sarah. "It's almost time for the toast." They walked together toward the group, their hands intertwined, their steps synchronized by familiarity and shared time. As they approached, conversations gradually died down, faces turning toward them with expectation. Elliot took a glass, waiting for everyone to do the same. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began, his voice clear in the tranquil country air. "To Willow, who today completes her first year, and who reminds us every day of the beauty of seeing the world with new eyes. The glasses were raised, glinting under the sun. "And to Laurel," he continued, looking at his wife with an intensity that made color rise to her cheeks, "who a year ago did me the honor of becoming my wife, and every day since then has taught me that true success isn't measured in possessions or appearances, but in authenticity and love." "To Willow and Laurel," chorused the voices around the table. "And if I may," interjected Laurel, taking her own glass, "I'd like to toast to all of you, to our families who gave us strong roots, to our friends who gave us wings to fly, and to life, which taught us that we don't have to choose between roots and wings, but that we can and should have both." The glasses were raised again, and as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, tinting the countryside in reddish and golden tones, Laurel and Elliot exchanged a look that contained a whole universe of shared understanding. Because in the end, they had discovered together the simplest yet most profound truth, that true love isn't about molding the other according to our expectations, nor transforming ourselves to please, but about creating a space where each can be authentically who they are, where differences aren't obstacles but opportunities to grow and learn. And as Willow laughed in her grandmother's arms, her small hands trying to capture the sunset light filtering through the leaves of the century-old maple tree, Laurel and Elliot knew that they had managed to build together something more valuable than any conventional success, a home for the soul, with roots deep enough to anchor them and wings strong enough to lift them. True love isn't about possessing or being possessed, but about liberating and being liberated, about creating spaces where each can grow in their own truth, without fear of losing or being lost. Because when you truly love, you don't lose anything of yourself. You simply discover parts you didn't know existed.